The day Bridget Osey almost quit, she had flour on her uniform, a bruise under her left eye, and exactly $43 in her bank account. She didn't mean to cry. That was the thing she kept telling herself afterward, standing in the walk-in pantry of the Sterling Group's executive floor kitchen, with her back pressed against the shelving and her hand clapped over her mouth. She was 28 years old. She had survived worse. She had survived her mother's illness and her father walking out when she was 12 and 3 years of double shifts at a diner in Sudbury before she'd finally gotten her Red Seal certification and moved to Toronto. She had survived worse than this. But the bruise was throbbing, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and when the pantry door swung open, she couldn't move fast enough to hide either of those things. She'd expected one of the other kitchen staff, maybe Renata, who ran prep on Tuesdays, or one of the servers who was always sneaking in to steal sparkling water. It was not Renata. Nathaniel Harlow Sterling stood in the doorway of the pantry, in a suit that probably cost more than Bridget's monthly rent, holding a coffee cup and looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. He was tall. She'd registered that on her first day, 3 weeks ago, the way everyone on the 42nd floor seemed to register when he walked through. 40, maybe 41. Dark hair going silver at the temples. The kind of face that photographers put on the covers of financial magazines, not because it was perfect, but because it made people want to know what he was thinking. Right now, he was thinking something that made him very still. "I'm sorry," Bridget said immediately. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I just needed a minute. I'll get back to stop." He said it quietly. Not harsh, just firm, the way a person speaks when they're used to being listened to without raising their voice. She stopped. He looked at her face, not in the invasive way that her old boss at the diner used to look at her. Cataloging, calculating. This was different. He was looking at the bruise. "Who did that to you?" The question was so direct and so unexpected that Bridget felt her carefully assembled composure crack right down the middle. She looked away. Outside the pantry, she could hear Renata calling an order, the sound of something sizzling on the flat top, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday afternoon. "I walked into a door," she said. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she had to look back at him. Nathaniel Sterling had not moved. His expression hadn't changed much either, but something behind his eyes had gone very quiet and very focused, the way the air goes quiet before a storm shifts direction. "Bridget," he said. She'd been working on this floor for 3 weeks and he'd never used her name before. She hadn't known he knew it. "Mr. Sterling, who did that to you?" She pressed her lips together. Her hands had not stopped shaking. The bruise under her eye was the kind that comes from knuckles, not door frames, and they both knew it. And she hated that he knew it, and she hated even more that she couldn't find the composure to deflect it properly. "It's not something you need to worry about," she said. "It's a personal matter. I'm fine." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he stepped fully into the pantry, set his coffee cup down on the nearest shelf, and pulled the door almost closed behind him. Not shut, not locked, just enough to take them out of the sight lines of the kitchen. "My building," he said. "My staff. When something happens to someone in my building, it becomes my concern. I'm a contract hire through the catering company. I'm not technically, Bridget." His voice was patient, almost gentle. It didn't match the reputation, which was what unsettled her. You couldn't work in Toronto's financial district for 3 years without hearing about Nathaniel Sterling. The Sterling Group had absorbed 4 competing firms in 18 months. He was the kind of man who sent handwritten notes to the people he'd just laid off and somehow made them feel like they'd been done a favor. Nobody quite knew what to make of him. "I'm going to ask you one more time, who did that to you?" She looked at the floor, at her own hands, which were pressing flour into the creases of her apron. At the steel shelving stacked with dry goods and the small window above it that let in a grey rectangle of October sky. Her younger brother Kofi was 17. He still had 1 year of high school left. He was good at math, quietly brilliant at it, the kind of kid his teachers had been trying to get into enrichment programs since grade 8. He lived with their aunt in Scarborough now, had been living there since their mother's second hospitalization, and he was fine. He was mostly fine. Except that 3 months ago he'd gotten pulled into something at school. Not drugs, not what Bridget had feared, but worse in some ways, because it had a face and a name. The name was Derek Foss. Derek Foss was 26, which made him too old to be hanging around secondary schools, and he ran a small constellation of side businesses out of a commercial property on Lawrence Avenue East that her brother had gotten tangled up with through a mutual friend who'd since smartly disappeared. Kofi hadn't taken anything, hadn't sold anything, had simply been in the wrong place and been seen, and that had apparently been enough for Derek Foss to decide Kofi owed him something. Last week, Derek Foss had delivered that message to Bridget directly. in the parking lot of the grocery store, where she bought her aunt's groceries on Sunday afternoons. She'd filed a police report. The officer had been sympathetic and efficient, and had told her these things took time. Time was not something Derek Foss seemed interested in giving her. "His name is Derek Foss," Bridget heard herself say. She hadn't decided to say it. It came out anyway, the way things do when you've been holding them alone long enough. She stopped. Swallowed. "My brother got connected to him through someone at school. He says Kofi owes him money, which isn't true, but he's been making sure we know he's serious." Nathaniel Sterling listened to all of this without interrupting. Without changing his expression much either, though something in the set of his jaw had shifted. "How old is your brother?" he asked. 17. "And this man came to you because Kofi doesn't have anything. I'm the one with the paycheck." She said it flatly. There was something almost relieving about stating it plainly after 3 weeks of trying to act like her life outside this building was not slowly coming apart. He said if I didn't come up with what he was calling the debt by the end of the month, he'd find other ways to collect. End of the month, Nathaniel said. That's Friday. She hadn't realized he'd done that math so quickly. Yes. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it, not at her, for a moment. Then, "Come to my office when your shift ends. Don't go home the usual way tonight. Go through the lobby and take a cab, not the subway. I'll cover it." Bridget stared at him. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not asking you to. I know you're not." He looked at her again, direct, unhurried. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He left the pantry before she could argue. For a long moment she stood there in the middle of the dry goods, her hands finally, still, flour drying in the lines of her palms, trying to figure out what had just happened. She didn't go to his office when her shift ended. She told herself it was because she wasn't the kind of person who accepted help from employers, which was true and had been a point of pride since she was 19. She told herself it was because his offer had probably been reflexive, the kind of thing a man in his position said in the moment and didn't actually mean. She was 3 stops in when her phone buzzed, an unknown number, but the text read, "Bridget, my office, or I send a car. Your choice. N.S." She stared at the screen for a full stop and a half. The train was warm and crowded and smelled like rain-damp wool. The woman beside her was knitting something orange. Across the aisle, a teenager was asleep with his backpack on his lap, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked enough like Kofi that her chest did something complicated. She got off at the next stop and took a cab back to the financial district. Nathaniel Sterling's office occupied the corner of the 42nd floor and had windows on 2 sides, which meant that at 6:30 in the evening, with the city lights coming on below, it looked like something out of a film. He was on the phone when she arrived. His assistant, a composed man named Paul who seemed to run on espresso and efficiency, had waved her straight through, which told her she'd been expected. She stood in front of the windows and looked at Toronto while she waited. The CN Tower lit in the distance. Lakeshore traffic moving below in red and white rivers. She'd been in this city for 5 years and it still occasionally surprised her with its own scale. "Sorry." Nathaniel hung up and came around the desk. He didn't sit behind it, she noticed. He stopped about 6 feet away, a distance that felt deliberate. Close enough to talk, far enough to not be the thing blocking the exit. "Thank you for coming back. You threatened to send a car." The corner of his mouth moved. "Not quite a smile, I did." She turned from the window. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what you think you can. My assistant ran Derek Foss's name this afternoon," he said. Bridget stopped. "He has 2 prior charges, both stayed. One for extortion, one for assault causing bodily harm. The assault charge was stayed because the witness recanted." He paused. "People tend to recant when they're frightened." "I know," she said quietly. "He's also got a current civil matter running against a company he nominally owns on Lawrence Avenue East. Financial irregularities, the kind that attract certain kinds of attention." He looked at her steadily, the kind of attention that tends to make people like Derek Foss very uncomfortable. Bridget felt something cold and careful settle in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I know people," Nathaniel said simply. "The right kind of people who have a professional interest in the kind of activities Derek Foss appears to be running. A phone call, the right phone call to the right person, tends to redirect that kind of man's energy very quickly toward his own problems." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. Thinking, she realized. Actually thinking about how to answer honestly. "Because I've seen what happens when it doesn't get done," he said finally. "I grew up in Thunder Bay. My mother cleaned offices for 20 years. There was a man, a landlord technically, though that's a generous term for what he was, who spent the better part of a decade making her life difficult in exactly this kind of way. Small threats, showing up at inopportune times, making sure she understood that her situation was precarious. He stopped, set his coffee cup down on the desk behind him. Nobody made a phone call. Nobody knew anyone. And my mother spent 20 years being afraid of a man who didn't deserve 20 minutes of her attention. Bridget was quiet. "I'm not trying to make this about me," he said. "I'm telling you because you asked why. That's why." She looked down at her hands. The flour was gone. She'd washed up before her shift ended. But she could still feel the faint ghost of the shaking from the pantry. The particular exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together for too long in front of too many people. "My brother doesn't know the extent of it," she said. "Kofi. He knows Derek Foss has been in contact, but he doesn't know about the parking lot. He doesn't know about—" She gestured vaguely at her face. "I didn't want him to feel like it was his fault. Because it's not. He was 17 and he made a bad connection and that's all it was. It's not his fault," Nathaniel agreed. "And you've been carrying this alone for how long?" 3 weeks. Since you started here." She hadn't thought about it that way. She looked up at him. "I didn't exactly have a choice about the timing." "No," he said. "You didn't." There was a long pause. Outside, the city did its indifferent evening thing, thousands of lit windows going about thousands of different lives. Somewhere below, a siren started up and faded. "If you make this phone call," Bridget said carefully, "and it works, what does that cost?" He looked at her as though the question surprised him slightly. Then, "Nothing. It costs nothing, Bridget. It's not a transaction. Everything is a transaction, not this." His voice was even. "You're not in debt to me. You're not going to owe me anything. If I make this call, I make it because it's the right thing to do. And then you go home and your brother finishes his last year of school and you go on with your life." A small pause. That's all. She wanted to not believe him. She'd built a very functional life on not believing men who offered things freely, because in her experience the price always surfaced eventually. She'd learned that from her father and refined it through a series of employers who'd confused obligation with gratitude. But Nathaniel Sterling was looking at her with an expression that was so straightforwardly honest, tired, even like a man who was accustomed to people assuming he wanted something in return, that she found herself believing him anyway. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "Make the call." He nodded once. "I will. Tonight. And if it doesn't work, then we figure out what's next." Together, he said it without fanfare, as though together was a perfectly ordinary word for a man in his position to use with someone who'd been working in his kitchen for 3 weeks. "But it'll work." She looked at him for another moment. Then, "You grew up in Thunder Bay?" Something shifted in his face, warmer. "Northwood Street. You, Sudbury, Northern Ontario girl, through and through." She found somewhat to her own surprise that she was almost smiling. "You hide it well, 42nd floor habit." He picked up his phone from the desk. "Go home, Bridget. Take the cab. Paul has the account. Just tell him." "I always lock my door." "I know you do." She left his office with her coat buttoned and her bag on her shoulder, and when she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed on the 42nd floor, she stood there in the chrome and glass box and did something she hadn't done in 3 weeks. She breathed. Paul was at his desk, and he did have the cab account, and he waved her off with a cheerful efficiency that suggested he'd arranged considerably stranger things for considerably stranger reasons. The cab was warm. The driver had a radio station going, something soft and country, not what she would have picked, but not unwelcome either. She texted Kofi from the back seat, "Just checking in. How was school?" His reply came back in 40 seconds. "Decent. Made a 94 on the calc test." She looked at that for a long time. 94 on a calculus test. Her 17-year-old brother, who was quietly brilliant, who still had 1 year left, who deserved to have that year be just a year, and not the thing that it had been threatening to become. She typed back, "That's my guy." Then, after a pause, "I'll call you this weekend. Got some good news." She wasn't sure yet if it was true, but she thought it might be. Derek Foss called her the following afternoon. She was on her break, sitting in the staff area on the 38th floor with a cup of tea, and she almost didn't answer. She answered, "Miss O.C." His voice was different from how it had been in the parking lot, flatter, less theatrical. "I think we had a misunderstanding." Bridget wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Did we? I may have overstated some things with regard to the timeline." A pause. "I think we can consider the matter resolved." She didn't say anything. "I'm going through some administrative complications at the moment. I think it's in everyone's best interest to let things lie." "I think that's wise," Bridget said. The call ended 4 seconds later. She sat with her tea and the 48th floor view of a grey November sky, and the particular feeling of something that has been pressing on your sternum for weeks suddenly lifting. It was not dramatic. It did not feel the way it does in films. It felt like a Tuesday afternoon and a cup of Earl Grey going lukewarm, and that was enough. She thought about calling her aunt. She would, later. She thought about texting Kofi. She would, later too. She thought about a man on a 42nd floor who'd grown up on Northwood Street in Thunder Bay, whose mother had cleaned offices, who apparently knew the right people and was willing to make the right calls. Not because of debt or transaction or any of the reasons she'd been conditioned to expect, but because, as best she could tell, he simply thought it was the right thing to do. She didn't know what to do with that yet. It didn't fit the architecture of the world she'd built. She supposed she had time to figure it out. The next morning she arrived at 5:50 for the 6 o'clock prep shift, because she was always early, because that was the kind of person she was. She came through the service entrance the way she always did, badged through the kitchen door, hung up her coat, and tied on her apron. At 6:15, Nathaniel Sterling appeared at the kitchen door. Not in his usual path to wherever he went in the mornings, but stopped there, like a man who had walked out of his way to stop. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "He called." Something in Nathaniel's face settled. Not satisfaction exactly, quieter than that. More like a man putting down something heavy. "Good," he said. "Thank you," she said, plainly. Without the qualification she'd been rehearsing since the cab ride home. He held her gaze for a moment. "How's your brother? 984 on a calculus test." The corner of his mouth moved. "Tell him to keep it up." "I will." He nodded once, and then he continued down the hall the way he'd presumably been going, and Bridget turned back to her prep work. The mise-en-place for the board lunch, 40 covers. The osso buco that needed another hour in the braising liquid. And the kitchen filled up around her the way it always did, noisy and warm and busy, and she was part of it. Renata arrived at 6:30 and immediately began an extended complaint about the elevator being slow. And Bridget listened and nodded and handed her a coffee. And the day moved the way days do when the thing you've been holding your breath about has finally exhaled. She was fine. She was, for the first time in 3 weeks, genuinely fine. And somewhere on the 42nd floor, in a corner office with windows on 2 sides, a man who'd grown up in Thunder Bay and learned something about the cost of silence had already moved on to the next call, the next decision, the next thing that needed doing. But he'd made this one first. And that, Bridget thought, as she lifted the lid on the braising pot and let the steam rise, was the kind of thing that stayed with a person.